everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
Install the TrashBot, and then you dispose of your items one item at a time into the sensing chamber that kind of does the sorting. We have a monitor on TrashBot that kind of directs users to dispose of one item at a time. We find that 95% of people kind of comply with that technical requirement. The 5% that don't are usually disposing of mixed landfill items, so they would all be going to the same place. In the event that you dispose of multiple recycling items, our object detection would be able to tell that everything in the chamber is recyclable and kind of treat it appropriately. But a really kind of interesting thing that we have seen is, once we've been installed for some time, we've gotten some data on kind of the low-hanging fruit from a behavior change perspective. Let's say it's as an example, plastic bottles with too much fluid inside of them. We're able to deploy content on the monitor that kind of addresses that particular behavior change. So something to the effect of empty your plastic bottles before you toss them, or else TrashBot can't recycle it. And what we find in the data is that with very small tweaks in behavior, you can see, upwards of a 60% increase in recyclability for particular classifications of items.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for our show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I am joined by Charles Yhap, co-founder and CEO of Clean Robotics. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
So, Charles, let's first give a backdrop. In the U.S., and certainly many developed countries and economic blocs like the EU, for instance, we have some serious glaring deficiencies and challenges when it comes to recycling infrastructure. And part of that is because of long legacy, multi-decade decision to outsource and depend on China and Southeast Asia to handle all our recycling and, frankly, our NIMBY problems, not in my backyard problems. What does that mean for the US and EU? And why is recycling such a thorny issue?
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. So as you kind of alluded to, a lot of our recycling and waste management problems or infrastructure were really designed for really high volume, kind of poor quality outputs. And the expectation when those projects were kind of financed and built was that there would always be a place like China to take those commodities. Since then, China has implemented a few iterations of a green fence or a national sword policy, which has basically raised the standard of recyclable commodities imported to the country. And the net effect of that has been that it's been a near ban on recyclable commodities going into China because those commodities are very, very contaminated, and China has its own kind of sustainability goals and health goals for its population. So, it's basically just tired of taking the world's garbage, which I think is reasonable. But the effect of that on the United States and other developed economies like the European Union and others is that, we basically have to figure out a way to clean up our act and figure out a way to make sure that the commodities that are coming out of the output side of a recycling plant are clean enough so that our domestic industries are able to do something with those commodities. A correlate of that is that other industries have to spring up to kind of backfill the amount of commodities that were previously taken by Asia and now don't have like the same kind of global markets. A lot of industries, a lot of kind of major players have figured out a way to find purchasers abroad again, but the general trend line is that a lot of these countries are kind of following China's lead and raising standards on the amount of contamination that they're willing to accept from developed economies.
And for good reason. I mean, when
Mhm,
they take
mhm,
in these semiconductor and computer chips and laptops, they have very dangerous chemicals that seep into the
mhm,
ground and water tables and really affects the quality and safety and health of those people.
mhm,
Now,
mhm.
let's talk about the mirage of recycling in the US. And I'll take Whole Foods as an example because I think they probably do the best job, at least in the US, versus, let's say, Finland and Scandinavian countries that go even further.
Mhm,
Is
mhm,
that when you go to Whole Foods, there's not just recycling and garbage, there's easily 4 or 5 different types of separation.
mhm, mhm.
Now, it sounds great from a consumer, but what happens when it actually gets picked up and the back end processing?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny that you mentioned Whole Foods because uh, experiences that we had at Whole Foods were in part inspiration for our core technology. Um, so yeah, what happens when things get picked up? And you kind of use the word mirage, which I think is a really great word. I typically use the analogy of the Wizard of Oz effect, where you have kind of something happening up front, but there's something else going on, behind the scenes, behind the face of the wizard. Uh, Most recyclables in the United States are actually not recovered, and I think this is kind of true across the world. But we have most of our customers in the United States, and when things get picked up, so let's kind of go through the life cycle of a Whole Foods waste bin or any other kind of forward-facing waste bin. So an ordinary person, let's say moving through an airport or what have you, will dispose of items into a waste bin. Those waste bins will then be collected by custodians. They're taken to kind of a back of the house dumpster. Then a hauler that's under contract with that facility will pick up those dumpsters of the various streams. Depending on what stream it is, it might go to a transfer station, it might go directly to a landfill, it might go to a waste to energy plant, it might go to a recycling plant, it might go to a composting facility. Oftentimes, what happens is all of these things from the bin are mixed together in the dumpster, and they're not actually treated separately. And then it is up to kind of the municipality to try and separate all of these things that were mixed together, or people will put things into the wrong bin, kind of doing what we call aspirational recycling. I'm not exactly sure where to put this thing, but I think it might be a recyclable. So I'm going to put it in the recycling bin and somebody will figure it out later. And what ends up happening is that nobody figures it out later because, recycling plants are moving tonnage, per minute. And it's just very difficult to decontaminate a recycling stream once you have contaminants in there. And that's kind of the societal promise of our technology.
Now, I'll be the first one to admit that I'm probably the aspirational recycler in the sense that I like to believe that more things can be recyclable than not. And I probably am the one that's guilty of contaminating. Now, let's talk about what is Clean Robotics and how is Clean Robotics addressing this massive issue that is haunting, frankly.
Yeah, yeah. And no, I think most people that care are guilty of aspirational recycling too. So it's the rule of thumb that I use at my house is if in doubt, throw it out, because it's better to have a small item go to landfill than to have contaminants in the recycling stream, which are really hard to get out. Our technology is called TrashBot. It's a system that uses AI, robotics, and computer vision to detect waste as you throw it away. And it robotically separates any 1, 2, 3, or 4 streams in the United States, most commonly that's recycling, landfill, and compost. It separates those streams 300% more accurately than the public, captures data on everything that goes through an individual TrashBot, and it collates that across the fleet. We use that data to improve our algorithm over time. So TrashBots get smarter and more accurate over time. We also use it to represent data that is useful for facilities. The type of facilities we're targeting are really high traffic public facing facilities where the size of their problem justifies a solution like ours. We're getting the most traction with international airports, material interest from hospitals, universities, and we also think there's a bright future for us in stadiums, convention centers, and arenas and malls.
Now, there's a very basic but a very important question: is why should we care about waste data?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it kind of depends, who you are. For our particular facilities, they care about waste data for a few reasons. Number one, they want to know that the strategies and tactics that they're implementing with our technology, or even agnostic to our technology, are having the effect that they intend. It can be used to improve custodial operations and the use of materials like garbage bags and cleaning supplies. It can be used to implement strategies around purchasing. So, for example, our data would be able to show what percentage of consumables are going to landfill because they're not recyclable or they're not compostable. So with that information, you would then be able to say, well, if we replaced, let's say this styrofoam clamshell with a compostable clamshell, what would be the impact of that? And on a related note, what would be the carbon impact of all of the things that we're implementing across our facility from a waste management and consumption perspective? What would be the projected impact of any changes that we would implement on a diversion from landfill perspective, as well as from a carbon abatement perspective?
Yeah, I think it provides a kind of end-to-end visibility that, frankly, many businesses don't have. And just to give another analogy, is there are startups that's working on food waste, specifically in the back of kitchens where food scraps get thrown away. And these computer vision types of systems can actually start to have data around what types of food. So, for example, in an entree, the peas versus the corns versus a broccoli get thrown out more often. So should we reduce that portion, actually save money, and actually reduce wastage, and be able to actually inform the front end based on the back end types of data that's being driven, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, let's talk a little bit about how to implement this, because it does not require real huge behavioral change, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So no, it really doesn't. So it's really just kind of install the TrashBot, and then you dispose of your items one item at a time into the sensing chamber that kind of does the sorting. We have a monitor on TrashBot that kind of directs users to dispose of one item at a time. We find that 95% of people kind of comply with that technical requirement. The 5% that don't are usually disposing of mixed landfill items, so they would all be going to the same place. In the event that you dispose of multiple recycling items, our object detection would be able to tell that everything in the chamber is recyclable and kind of treat it appropriately. But a really kind of interesting thing that we have seen is, once we've been installed for some time, we've gotten some data on kind of the low-hanging fruit from a behavior change perspective. Let's say it's, as an example, plastic bottles with too much fluid inside of them. We're able to deploy content on the monitor that kind of addresses that particular behavior change. So something to the effect of, empty your plastic bottles before you toss them, or else TrashBot can't recycle it. And what we find in the data is that with very small tweaks in behavior, you can see, upwards of a 60% increase in recyclability for particular classifications of items.
And I really like this feedback mechanism, because when you think about high food traffic areas, let's say cafeterias or fast foods, for instance, there is a self-cleaning approach that people take, which is they take the tray and just kind of dump it all out into a garbage can, right? So you're retraining them to effectively do one at a time, so that the system can actually handle it, process it properly from computer vision, and also the mechanical pieces as well. So that's really interesting, and it kind of helps them to think through the fact that before it was just something that I just kind of offloaded. It was not my liability, but now I'm being very thoughtful about as I'm doing one at a time, it forces me to think about, maybe in the future, I only use a fork. Maybe I don't need to get a plastic knife and a plastic spoon as well, for instance.
Yeah, and what we find is, for example, recently we had an installation in Texas, and we kind of overheard some of the engineering team at the install talking about recycling, and kind of that they were expressing a lack of faith that what they were doing would actually end up in a recycling plant and actually getting recovered. But one of the interesting things is those same two engineers interacting with TrashBot had a lot more confidence that if they did things correctly, that things would end up in the right place. And so I think there's obviously a credibility gap that, for better or worse, maybe it's partially earned, the recycling industry has to kind of bridge. But I think technology like ours, that's high fidelity, captures data on everything, is able to accurately represent that in a way that is engaging to users, goes a long way to kind of bridge that credibility gap, and hopefully will be helpful to the industry writ large.
So this is a perfect topic around credibility. So you guys are the front end, you're the customer facing. So even if there's credibility, how do you ensure there's deeper trust because they don't have visibility into what happens afterwards? So talk to us about both from a partnership, but also from a methodology so that what gets collected and collated to the various streams are properly being handled on the back end side with the appropriate processors.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is fairly complex. So we work with our customers to make sure that they're working with their haulers to guarantee is maybe too strong of a word, but ensure or validate that their waste is being treated in the way that they expect. So if they're sending recyclables through a recycling hauler, that things are ending up in the right place. That is a kind of thorny topic across the industry. The other thing that we're seeing kind of from an ecosystem perspective is the advent of other technologies. Let me rephrase that. Other products and offerings and services using technologies comparable to ours, that's artificial intelligence, data analytics, computer vision, and so forth, that complement the value stack across players. So for example, a company like Yhap Robotics that uses computer vision and AI and data analytics to sort waste at recycling plants is able to report what they're seeing at tonnage in extremely high fidelity. And so the advent of technologies like ours across the ecosystem is going to go and is already making tremendous waves and kind of adding visibility and creating credibility and transparency to, pardon the pun, a really messy industry.
So I have two different sets of questions. One is around lobbying and legislation. So the hauler, as an example, is a great problem area that's going to be difficult to handle because some of this is done on a municipal level, but it's going to vary by county, by state, and certainly by different regions. So how do you have a kind of a federal overarching accountability, almost an enforcement mechanism through lobbying, right, effort, so that the haulers are held accountable for what they're truly hauling versus whatever's the quickest and that gets their KPIs done. So that's one. The second question is around the fact that the ecosystem is, you're right, all the way through the entire value chain are starting to incorporate computer vision, robotic arms, and other types of automation capabilities at very high fidelity, high speed. And how can they work together from an ecosystem, from a data sharing, so that they can actually bridge that data so that there's less data, there's less gaps in the data, so that it's better reportable, and it also actually helps to support some of the lobbying and bolstering of the legislation and policy changes that you're trying to make as well. Because again, all of this ties into climate change. All of this ties into to even fuel, because you think about, for example, the airline industry, and that's trying to move into sustainable aviation fuel to biofuels. It all plays into the Inflation Reduction Act. It all plays into climate action. They all have relevance from food waste to everything that I'm talking about. So ultimately, it's about data and using data to arm and to move policies forward.
Yeah, those are great questions. So I guess I'll start with your first one, just going in order. And if I miss an aspect of it, feel free to just kind of flag that, and I'll talk about it. So on the regulatory front, I think every player in our industry is cognizant that there are tailwinds around the world, for lack of a better expression, fostering demand for the technologies that we're building. So for example, extended producer responsibility regimes are taking a pretty good foothold in Europe and Canada. They're very nascent in the United States. Regimes that will mandate a price differential between landfill as kind of a higher price versus recycling and compost. Those are material tailwinds, and it kind of depends, how that's being enforced. Is it being enforced at the facility or the generator level? Is it being enforced with haulers? All of that is going to kind of slightly shift the incentives and the disincentives. In general, I'm in favor of driving that towards producers of things, who's making the consumables. Those consumables should be increasingly sustainable, right? Using less plastic, more compostable polymers and so forth. And then, how are regulations being enforced with recyclers and landfill operators, and how are those being crafted? I think my experience has been that startups and really folks that are kind of breaking ground on innovation with regard to artificial intelligence, robotics, computer vision, data analytics, because we're so focused on the bread and butter and in the weeds of operationally growing a new technology and a new company, taking an active role in lobbying and policy crafting is just kind of less urgent, although everyone agrees that it's really important. So I think it would be really fantastic, especially in the United States, for folks at the federal level to tap startups like mine into and getting us a seat at the table during policy crafting and that type of thing. You mentioned the fact that there really isn't a cohesive and coherent federal policy around recycling, and that's part of why our technology is so useful, because there's no unified standard that is enforced. And so what that means in practice is recycling rules and criteria vary from place to place. They vary based on the technological capabilities of each local recycling plant. And what that means for the consumer and the user is that it's all just very confusing. So it's kind of a perfect problem for artificial intelligence, but it also means it's a really thorny problem to solve from a federal regulation perspective. And then you also have the question of state rights, which is perhaps unique to the United States.
Tell us about where you are from a product maturity, and if you're able to share, the kind of number of installment base or units that are out there and deployed, and what's on the product roadmap?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are shipping our production units currently. We're looking to have 600 units booked before the end of the year. We're well on our way there, about 430 or so closed and closing. We're looking to have in the hundreds of units deployed before the end of the year, and kind of going into Q1.
And how are you guys tying your data to, let's say, carbon accounting or forensic types of software, and even ERP and cloud that's trying to capture different companies' decarbonization strategies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you're kind of alluding to, there's a major interest among large, complex organizations and corporate entities, especially in Europe, which is to a large extent driven by regulation around ESG and carbon reporting. So we use very simple formulas to calculate, per ton of recyclables that's diverted, what that equates to in terms of carbon abatements, using independent standards put out by the EPA. And so we're just able to report that on an ongoing basis on our dashboard. And we're also able to project, if you were to implement this particular purchasing strategy or this particular waste management strategy, what would be the impact of that from a recycling, diversion, or a compost and food waste diversion perspective, and the impact of that on carbon abatements associated with your facility. Which, by the way to get that same information now is through a process called a waste audit, which is a very manual process. It literally involves people by hand opening garbage bags and recycling bags, diving through dumpsters, weighing items, counting them on a clipboard and a piece of paper, and we're able to automate that entire process.
Well, I'm thinking about this one particular Irish startup that is focusing on carbon accounting software for multinationals that have very complex manufacturing and supply chain, and it's just difficult. And what the CEO was saying was that part of the reason there's been a really strong adoption of his platform is because of the fact that the European laws, the policies, almost mandated that these types of multinationals have to have a decarbonization plan, net zero plan, they need to be held accountable. And there's actually a stick, meaning if they don't meet it, there's going to be penalties, including tariffs on their products and services. So again, I go back to the lobbying in the sense of I'm not a big fan of lobbying, but there is value in consortium. Consortium that is effectively run in a kind of independent fashion, so you're not being pulled away from your operational aspects of your startup, but consortium that represents the voice, so that there are standards that are made so that governments and cities and counties are almost in a way have to choose something like your solution if they are to stay compliant.
Yeah. And I think that reminds me of the second question, which is around data compatibility and the impact of that on regulation. And I agree. I've often thought about the value of kind of a consortium for AI waste management technologies, or something to that effect, because I think there is a unified interest in the marketplace here, and there's certainly a unified interest for humanity to manage waste and carbon emissions associated with waste in a way that's more thoughtful and intelligent and sustainable. And with regard to kind of data compatibility, we at Clean Robotics, we kind of believe that this is it's a really big pie. There's a lot of space here for everybody. There's a lot of space for new entrants to make a difference. And we're proactively collaborating with a number of new entrants on sharing data structures, taxonomies, and things that are really just helpful for everybody to be speaking the same language, such that customers will be less confused when interacting with us versus with another new entrant, as well as regulators will be assessing information in a common knowledge and a common taxonomy that can be used to make decisions and craft policies. So 100% agree. I think it's really critical. And I think it's better to make these connections and collaborations early on before the whole industry gets ahead of its skis.
Absolutely. And my final comment is, because one of the things you talked about is ultimately the responsibility goes back to the producers, meaning let's say the CPGs that are creating these packaging, for instance. And I think while they may be aware of from the boxes to the plastic packaging that they use, if we can tie the actual components that actually ends up in the landfill and hold them accountable from a financial accounting perspective, that's a huge incentive or disincentive for them to figure out how to streamline their processes so that they don't have to utilize so much oil and gas based types of petrol products. To me, again, it's the ability to be able to have that full end-to-end data and visibility and the accountability that goes with it, because you can't enforce if you don't have the data. So I'm very excited from that point of view. So I have been joined by Charles Yhap, co-founder and CEO of Clean Robotics. Thank you for joining today.
It was a real pleasure, Scott. Thanks for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.